It was a cold night in Rome when Michael's life was torn from him. A car crash, a dark moment of fate, and the world lost him. But Michael's death was just the beginning. For 6 minutes he saw the other side, where time stood still, and the voice of Jesus himself called out to him. In those minutes, Michael received a message, one that would change the course of history. Now, back in the land of the living, Michael carries a burden far too great for most to comprehend. His mission? Deliver a message from Jesus Christ to Pope Francis. But the world is watching and the forces of darkness are ready to strike. Can Michael and the Pope withstand the greatest spiritual battle of our time? Michael had always lived a good life, filled with faith and a quiet love for God. He grew up in a small town in Italy, always attending Mass and helping out in his community. But nothing in his life could prepare him for the night his life would be taken. It happened so quickly. One moment he was driving home and the next, his car collided with another vehicle on a rainy road. The force of the crash was overwhelming. The darkness took him before he even had a chance to process what was happening. He felt nothing, just a rush of cold, then silence. Then, he was no longer in the car. He was floating, weightless, surrounded by brilliant light. It wasn't the bright light of a sun or a star. No, it was something far more glorious. And in the center of that light, he saw him, Jesus, standing with arms open wide, a look of infinite love and sadness in his eyes. "You've been chosen, Michael," Jesus spoke, his voice reverberating through Michael's very soul. "You must return. The church is in peril. The Pope is not alone in this fight, but the battle is not easy." Michael felt a rush of overwhelming emotion, but he could not speak. Jesus continued, "Deliver this message to my servant Pope Francis. He is the shepherd of my flock, but he will face the darkness will rise against him, from within and from without, but he must stand firm in faith. I will not leave him. I will be his strength." Before Michael could respond, he was thrust back into his body. He gasped, inhaling air that felt both strange and familiar. His vision blurred. He was back, but why? He didn't understand. The doctors worked furiously around him, their words a blur, their hands a blur. One thing was clear, he was alive, and he had a message. As Michael regained his strength, confusion weighed heavily on him. How could he be alive? The crash had been severe. He was dead, wasn't he? For 6 minutes he was gone, yet now he stood on earth again, carrying a message too heavy for any man to bear alone. It wasn't long before Michael realized he needed to find the Pope. The message Jesus had given him was far too important to keep to himself. It was urgent, critical even for the future of the church. But getting to Pope Francis would not be easy. Michael knew that. The Vatican was a fortress, and the Pope was one of the most protected men in the world. Yet Michael also felt a divine certainty that he had been chosen for this purpose. He began his search. He tried everything. Letters, emails, calls, none of them worked. The world was filled with doubt and skepticism, and Michael's message seemed impossible to believe. No one believed him, except one person. A priest, deep in prayer in a small chapel, came to Michael with the understanding that he had been sent for a purpose. The priest, Father Giovanni, had known of the spiritual warfare that was overtaking the church. He had seen the signs. "I believe you," Father Giovanni said. "We will find a way to get you to the Pope." As Michael sat in the quiet chapel that night, his mind racing with thoughts of the Pope and the darkness that threatened the church, he was struck by a deep, unsettling dream. In this dream, the Pope stood alone in a grand basilica, holding his hands aloft in prayer. The walls of the church trembled, the air heavy with malevolent force. Shadows lurked in the corners, twisting and reaching toward him, threatening to swallow him whole. Suddenly, Jesus appeared before the Pope. His face was filled with both sorrow and strength, and he spoke a single word to Pope Francis, his voice like thunder, "Stand firm." The dream faded, but Michael's heart pounded. He knew now that this vision was more than just a dream. It was a message, a confirmation of the task ahead of him. He had to warn Pope Francis. He had to deliver the message. Finally, after weeks of effort and prayer, Michael stood outside the Vatican. Father Giovanni had used his connections to arrange a meeting with the Pope. Michael's heart raced in anticipation. This was the moment. He walked through the marble halls, each step echoing like a drumbeat in his chest. As he reached the papal chambers, Michael was led inside. Pope Francis stood waiting for him, his eyes kind but full of sorrow, as if he knew exactly why Michael had come. "You have seen it, haven't you?" the Pope asked, his voice soft but filled with a deep knowing. Michael nodded, his voice trembling. "Yes, I have seen the darkness that is coming. Jesus sent me to deliver a message." Pope Francis motioned for him to continue, and Michael repeated the prophecy exactly as he had been told. "The battle is not over, Your Holiness. The darkness will rise from within the church and from the world. But Jesus will not leave you. Stand firm in faith, for he will be your strength." Pope Francis bowed his head, deep in thought. Then, his voice, filled with a quiet, resolute strength, filled the room. I have known this trial was coming. Thank you for delivering this message. We must prepare, for the battle ahead will be one of the greatest the Church has ever faced. The message has been delivered, but the fight is far from over. If this story resonates with you, like, comment, and share it with those who need to hear this powerful message. For the Church, for Pope Francis, and for the strength to face what is coming. Join the conversation below. The months following Michael's arrival at the Vatican were filled with rising tension, an unseen war of souls unfolding in every corner of the Church. Pope Francis, despite his outward calm, could feel the immense weight of the task before him. The messages that Michael had delivered had not been taken lightly. The Pope understood the gravity of what was at stake. The spiritual heart of the Church was being torn apart from within, and the external forces of corruption, scandal, and doubt were threatening to unravel it. But there was more. Michael could sense it. The darkness was not only within the Church, it was outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. The world had become more volatile, more divided. People of faith were facing a crisis of belief. The love of Christ was being challenged from every side. As Pope Francis prayed in the Vatican's private chapel, Michael watched with reverence. He'd been asked to stay by the Pope's side, a silent witness to history unfolding. The Pope's words echoed in Michael's mind. Stand firm in the faith, just as Christ had told him. Michael, deep in prayer, pleaded with God for clarity, for guidance, for strength. One night, as Michael rested in his quarters, he had a vision. He saw the Pope standing in a vast field, alone. The sky was dark, but there was a single beam of light coming from above. The Pope raised his hands to the heavens, his body frail but resolute. Around him, thousands of souls, both living and departed, gathered, all in prayer. But in the distance, Michael saw shadows gathering, moving closer, circling like wolves. Jesus appeared beside the Pope, laying his hand on the Pope's shoulder, offering him comfort. He will endure, Jesus said. He will lead my people, but he must remain true to the call of my heart. Only then will the darkness be pushed away. The dream was clear. Pope Francis needed to stay connected to Christ, to keep his faith unwavering, for the storm was only just beginning. The following weeks proved Michael's vision correct. A scandal broke within the Church, one so profound it shook the very foundation of the Vatican. A prominent cardinal was accused of severe misconduct, his actions threatening to dismantle the credibility of the papacy. The media went into a frenzy, accusing the entire Church of hypocrisy and deceit. The faithful began to lose hope, and whispers of discontent filled the air. Pope Francis, though devastated by the revelation, remained focused. His personal grief was deep, but he understood that his mission was greater than any one individual's failings. He addressed the issue publicly, with grace, repentance, and a call for reconciliation. The darkness, however, did not let up. It was during this time that Michael felt a deeper urgency, a divine prompt urging him to act. Vatican Garden, Michael was approached by Father Giovanni, the priest who had helped him gain access to Pope Francis. Michael, we must prepare, Father Giovanni said quietly. The forces at work here are not simply human. There are powers, principalities, and forces of evil that seek to devour us. The Pope needs your strength now more than ever. Michael nodded solemnly. He understood. It was no longer just about the message. This was a spiritual battle, one that transcended politics, scandals, and earthly concerns. Michael began to devote himself to constant prayer, fasting, and contemplation, seeking to align his will with God's. The Church was under attack from every direction. There were rumors of conspiracies both within the Vatican walls and outside. Political powers sought to influence the papacy, vying for control. The world watched, and the faith of millions hung in the balance. Michael's role became more critical. He had to stand with Pope Francis, not only as an advisor but as a warrior of faith. It became clear that the Pope was being targeted by forces far beyond human comprehension. The darkness was growing stronger, and Michael felt it, whispering lies, sowing seeds of doubt, trying to divide. Late one night, as Michael prayed in the chapel, a sudden feeling washed over him. A cold chill ran down his spine as the room seemed to darken, shadows creeping toward him. He felt an unmistakable presence, an evil, an enemy. It wasn't the first time he'd felt it, but it was stronger than ever. The forces were closing in. Suddenly, the light in the chapel flickered, and Michael heard a voice, a cold, mocking voice. "You can't save him. You can't save them all." But Michael, filled with divine courage, shouted back, "By the power of Jesus Christ, I stand firm." The room lit up as if a bolt of divine energy had struck the very ground beneath him. The darkness recoiled, and the presence vanished. Michael, trembling, dropped to his knees, thanking God for his protection. The situation outside the Vatican grew worse. The Church's enemies, both spiritual and earthly, were now emboldened. Attempts on the Pope's life were foiled, but the threats were relentless. A close associate of the Pope was discovered to have been leaking information to the media, further eroding the confidence of the faithful. One evening, after a particularly devastating report from the media, Pope Francis called Michael into his private chambers. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. "Michael," the Pope said, his voice tired yet determined, "the darkness is pressing in on every side. I feel its weight, its breath on my neck, but I know I must remain firm in my faith no matter what." Michael placed a hand on the Pope's shoulder. "You will. Jesus is with you. We must remain close to him in prayer. Our strength comes from him alone." In that moment, Michael realized something profound. The Pope was human, vulnerable just like anyone else, but it was his faith that held him together. It was his ability to trust in God's will, even in the face of impossible odds, that made him a true leader. Days passed, and the forces of darkness became more overt. The Pope's life was at risk in ways Michael could not comprehend, but the message from Jesus had always been clear: stand firm. Stand firm in faith, in humility, in love. In the midst of chaos, the Pope held a mass, a powerful service that would go down in history. It was here that the forces of evil would make their final push, seeking to break the Pope's spirit and destabilize the Church once and for all. But as the Pope prayed, Michael stood beside him, his heart steady in the Lord's presence. Jesus, who had appeared to Michael so many times before, was with them now, his light shining brightly through the darkest of times. The evil forces that had been closing in suddenly retreated, as if they had met an invisible wall. The Pope's faith, unshaken and unwavering, had broken their power. The battle had been won, but it was only through the strength of God's love and the Pope's trust in Jesus. After the harrowing events of the last few months, Pope Francis's resolve was stronger than ever. The Church had faced its greatest challenges, but the victory over the dark forces was not just a fleeting moment, it was a turning point. The faithful had witnessed their Pope stand firm in the face of danger, not as a politician or leader, but as a servant of Christ, one who trusted completely in God's power. As Michael left the Vatican one last time, he couldn't help but look back. The basilica loomed large in the distance, its magnificent structure both a symbol of hope and a reminder of the sacrifices made to protect it. He had seen the weight the Pope carried, and he knew that the journey was far from over. One evening, as the Pope prepared for a private mass, he called for Michael. "There are more challenges to come," Pope Francis said, his voice filled with solemnity. "But we have witnessed what faith can do. We've seen that no force, no matter how dark, can withstand the light of Christ." Michael nodded, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He had seen firsthand the battle being fought, not just in the world, but within the Church itself. And it wasn't over yet. The Pope had gained new insight through all the trials, and his commitment to Christ's will had been deepened. As they stood together, the Pope looked up at the sky, his eyes reflecting a profound peace. "This victory is not mine alone," Pope Francis continued. "It is God's victory. I may lead his Church, but I am nothing without him." The next day, the Pope made an official proclamation, a call to the faithful to renew their commitment to prayer and to stand united against the darkness threatening the world. It wasn't just a religious message, it was a call to action. "I have been shown the truth of our faith," Pope Francis declared. "I stand as a servant of Christ, and so must each of you. Our mission is not to conquer the world with force, but to conquer it with love, faith, and prayer." The entire Vatican, and soon the world, was abuzz with his words. The message was clear. A new era was dawning, one where faith would be the true weapon against the darkness. While Pope Francis remained resolute, Michael's journey was just beginning. The victory over evil was temporary, and the forces of darkness were not ones to retreat quietly. They were biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Michael's role had been critical, but his mission had not been fully realized. Months passed, and there were whispers, subtle but growing louder, of a new crisis within the Church. A great division was looming. Some factions within the Vatican had begun to question the Pope's approach. His message of humility and service was not universally accepted. Some saw his words as weakness, while others, blinded by power, sought to manipulate the Church for their own gain. Michael found himself in a difficult position. The Church, while outwardly united in its purpose, was facing an inner crisis. He had become one of the Pope's most trusted advisors, but there was an unsettling sense of urgency in the air. The Pope had always preached love and forgiveness, but the dark forces surrounding the Vatican had begun to take a more dangerous form. It became clear that the battle was no longer just a spiritual one. It was political, social, and even personal. The enemy had infiltrated the very core of the Church, spreading lies, greed, and corruption. Michael's role was now one of constant vigilance, prayer, and guidance. He had seen the power of God's love, and he knew that it was only through that love that the church could survive what was coming. Just when Michael thought things had begun to settle, betrayal struck. One of the Pope's closest confidants was found to be conspiring against him. Cardinal Ciriaco, a man who had once been an ally of Pope Francis, had been secretly meeting with political figures who sought to undermine the Pope's authority. The news hit like a thunderclap. Michael was devastated. The Pope, too, was shaken by the betrayal, but he didn't falter. "This is the way of the world," Pope Francis said quietly when Michael confronted him. "Judas walks among us." In that moment, Michael realized the magnitude of the battle they were truly facing. This was no longer about merely defending the church from external threats. It was about protecting it from the inside, from the very people who were supposed to be the shepherds of the faith. The forces of darkness were relentless, and they would stop at nothing to tear down what God had built. Despite the betrayal, Pope Francis chose not to seek retribution. Instead, he called for prayer, asking the faithful to intercede on behalf of those who had gone astray. The message was simple yet profound. We must forgive, for we too have been forgiven. The Pope's actions were a testimony to the strength of his faith. He chose grace over vengeance, and in doing so, he proved that his trust in God was unwavering. The Vatican, though shaken, began to heal. After the betrayal and the internal battles that followed, a shift occurred within the church. The faithful, though tested by scandal and corruption, began to rally around the Pope. They recognized that his message of peace, forgiveness, and love was not just a call to personal piety, but a call to action. They had witnessed his commitment to Christ's mission, and now they too were ready to follow him into the new era. The Pope began to implement sweeping reforms within the church. His leadership, once questioned by some, was now embraced by the faithful as a beacon of hope in the midst of uncertainty. He called for transparency, for accountability, and most importantly, for a return to the true essence of Christ's love and grace. The church, though still under attack from external forces, began to flourish. The faithful stood united, recognizing that their strength was not in their worldly power, but in their unwavering faith in God. And Michael, as always, remained by the Pope's side, a steadfast witness to the transformation that was taking place. Years later, Pope Francis, now an elder statesman of the church, sat in the same chapel where he had once prayed for guidance in the midst of the greatest spiritual battle of his life. The church had endured, its foundations fortified by the love of Christ. The darkness had not been defeated entirely, but it had been pushed back, and the church had emerged stronger than before. Michael, now an elder himself, stood beside the Pope, watching as a new generation of believers took up the mantle of faith. The victory was not just the Pope's or Michael's, it was the victory of Christ. The Pope, speaking to a gathered congregation, shared one last message. The light of Christ will never be extinguished. No matter how great the darkness, his love will always prevail. As the congregation stood to their feet, Michael knew that the battle had been won, not through political power, not through influence, but through the simple, unwavering faith that had carried them all through. And in that moment, he knew that their mission was only just beginning. If this story has moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and comment on how this message of faith has inspired you. Stand firm in your own belief, and together, let's share the love of Christ with the world. Keep the light shining.